Hello, it's Devin, the free range author here. Welcome to the next installment of Wanderling's Choice. I'm going to be reading you from chapter 2. Oh, we're at that chapter. Well, at least it's not Deadly Conversations. All right, let's get into it. Chapter 2, Wanderling's Choice, The Horse Thieves. It seemed like just another horse fair. It was in a new land they had never visited before, at the foot of a chain of mountains. The people there had strange accents and ways. They seemed less likely to be friendly to strangers, especially a woman stranger, traveling alone, dressed in men's attire. Ree liked the countryside, but not the people. She decided to find out the news in the area from this horse fair and then move on to some place with friendlier, less taciturn inhabitants. She caught a glimpse of Shane at this fair way off in the distance, but he didn't see her. She decided to look him up later if the people here continued to frustrate her with their ways. And frustrate her they did. Nobody seemed willing to talk to her, except other women, and even the other women looked askance at her. They were polite enough, but the body language they gave off seemed to say, "What are you doing here, dressed like that?" She left Falcon tied to a fence rail to go buy a small meal from one of the food vendors. When she returned, she found two very scruffy, greasy-looking men taking a great interest in Falcon. Falcon seemed somewhat upset at their close proximity. He didn't enjoy their attention. "Excuse me, can I help you?" she said. The tone of her voice, which came out of her mouth, surprised her. She didn't mean to speak in such an irritated way. One man glanced at her as if she was a piece of furniture. "Go get your man. We need to speak to the owner of this horse." Reese stood up straight and tall. "I have no man, and the horse belongs to me." This response served to get their full attention focused now on her. She felt like Falcon a moment before, like a piece of meat being leered at by a hungry person covered in slime. Reese slipped one of her hands under her satchel and began to reach for the short sword she concealed underneath the cloak. One of the men shook his head and muttered, and not so quietly, "What's the world coming to when a no-account woman can own a horse, especially a good one, and a stallion at that?" Ree felt her face grow hot. She stiffened inwardly. "How much?" the other man said, speaking to her as if he expected her not to understand the concept. "Not for sale," she shot back clearly. They laughed as if she had made a bad joke. "Come on, Biddy, everything has its price," he said to her and looked her up and down lecherously. She knew exactly what he meant, and she did not appreciate being called Biddy. "Not him," she insisted. "Then what do you bring him to a horse fair if you didn't plan on selling him?" grumbled the other man tartly. Ree cleared her throat. "Sir, if you have a goodly mare you'd like to breed to him, then we can talk business. If not, then we have no business to discuss." Before they could reply to this, she whistled. Falcon untied himself from the slip knot she had secured him to the post with, and trotted eagerly over to her. She took hold of the rope, nodded to them both, and wished them good day, turned and left. She wanted to swing up on Falcon's back and gallop away as fast as she could run. But she didn't want to make a scene. She could feel their eyes boring into her back as she walked away. She walked Falcon to the center of a big throng of people and horses just to get him out of their sight. Normally Falcon would get all excited and start dancing and talking to all the other strange horses. But this time he was quiet and steady by her side. Falcon suddenly stopped and snorted in a friendly greeting at a man who blocked their path. "Shane!" Ree breathed a huge sigh of relief. Shane had a worried look on his face. "What are you doing here, Ree?" he said to her. Ree was startled at his tone of voice. He almost seemed angry with her. "This is no horse fair for you and Falcon should attend. There are some very unsavory individuals here." Ree rolled her eyes and shrugged. "Too late. I already bumped into the two prime examples," she replied. Shane took hold of her shoulder and stepped closer to whisper to her. "They do not deal well with women in this province, especially a businesswoman like yourself. What you're doing here is almost looked on as a crime. You need to leave now. Go far and fast before one of these rude brutes decides to teach you his lesson of respect. I will guard your departure." He handed her Falcon's tack and nodded. She passed Shane the lead rope, and he held Falcon as she saddled and bridled him as quickly as she was able to. He passed her the halter and lead rope, and she stuffed them in her saddlebags. She slid him a quick glance. Shane smiled, nodded again, and gave her shoulder an encouraging squeeze. Even though she did not need his help to mount Falcon, he boosted her on. As she gathered up the reins, he touched her arm. She looked down on him. The medallion. It looks beautiful on you, by the way, he said as he gazed up at her sitting in the saddle. The bright noonday sun erased some of the lines of worry from his face. Once again she wondered what the significance of the silver disc was and why he wouldn't tell her its meaning. Then she noticed the red feather that she had given him years ago was no longer in his floppy hat. Its shaft had been dipped in metal, and now it swung from a silver chain around his neck, barely hidden by his shirt. This made her pause. It was just a mere falcon's feather, simple, but obviously very special to him. Before she could think more on this, he clapped Falcon on the rump, and they galloped away, out of the throng of people, out of the horse fair gates, away from the festival. Many eyes took note of their departure. Ree rode Falcon hard and fast all day. When dusk came, she took him off the roads and into the woodlands. She rode for about an hour after sunset to find a well-hidden place to make camp. She left the bridle and saddle on Falcon, but loosened the girth and removed her bags. She decided against a fire and ate a cold meal instead. She was just about to roll herself into the blankets when there came a snapping sound of something large stepping on brittle branches. Falcon startled and his body language changed. He was no longer a horse relaxing after a hard day's ride. He was all tense and alert, his muscles twitching, ears poised forward in the direction of the sound. Ree, too, came to life. Her heart started to race. Was it a wild animal or worse? Her eyes searched the dark underbrush, but she saw nothing. Then a small white pouch sailed out of the woods and hit Falcon on the flank. It immediately exploded into a white powder. Falcon jumped and reared in fright, and with a small squeal. In his excitement, he spun into the white cloud, which was quickly rising from the ground. He suddenly staggered as if he was drunk and groaned. Ree knew exactly what had happened. Her horse was being drugged. She lunged for a pack and grabbed for the short sword at her side at the same moment, but a rough hand clutched hers before she could reach it and whipped her around to face her attacker. Her frightened eyes stared into the night-darkened face of one of the horse traders she had run afoul of earlier in the day. He smiled wildly at her. His breath had an awful stench, and most of his front teeth were missing. Then a fist, hard as a brick, crashed into her face, and the world went black. Ree woke up to grass beneath her. Her whole face was swollen, hot, and throbbing, and she couldn't open her right eye. She tried to carefully assess her surroundings. A large fire had been built in the clearing. Falcon lay just beyond her on the ground. His hooves were bound tight, and his sides were heaving, so she knew he was still alive. There was a small huddle of raw-boned, wormy-looking horses tied to a picket line off in the shadows. They stood with their heads down and eyes closed, without grazing, as if they did not care what happened to them any more. But their hooves flashed and glittered strangely in the dark of the night. Ree tried to move her head without being seen and looked toward the campfire. 5 large man-shapes were gathered across from her, on the other side of the flames. They were drinking and laughing and poking through her belongings in the saddlebags. "How'd this broad get so much money?" one said in an alcohol-slurred voice. "Must have stolen it," coughed another. "Nice haul, though. We got ourselves a heavy pouch of gold, fine sword, and a good stallion to make a pretty penny off of. Bonuses all around. Drink up, boys." Another man belched rudely. "But what do we do with her?" "What do you mean?" "I mean we came to steal a horse. She was never part of the bargain." Another one snorted and sputtered into his mug. "Didn't you hear the boss? Bonuses all around. She's a bonus." The biggest man shape shrugged and waved as if it made no difference to him. "I don't care what you do with her. Sell her as a slave in the next town, tenderize her a bit, take turns having fun with her, and then dump her body in the river, whatever. I'm sure you'll think of something." Ree felt the breath in her throat turn icy. "She says she has no man. That means no one is looking for her." Another one guffawed as he slugged his drink. "She's not royalty, that's certain, so no good asking for a ransom." The smaller man coughed. "You ever heard of someone asking for a reward for a simple peasant lass? No one will miss her." They all laughed as one. "I guess that means we can all line up for a ride then." Ree's heart was pounding in terror by now. "Hey, she's moving. She's waking up." They all looked in her direction. Ree tried not to whimper in fear. "I'll fix that," grumbled the first one before any of his drunken fellows could stop him. He stooped and threw a hot rock from the fire at Ree. She whirled away, but it clocked her across the top of her head, etching a long bloody gash into her scalp. She moaned in pain and fought the new wave of unconsciousness which threatened to envelop her again. She tried to crawl away into the darkness. Running footsteps caught up with her, and she was suddenly pinned to the ground by a hobnailed boot. "Don't kill her," shouted one. "I like it when they scream." Ree moaned in helplessness. Without knowing why, the fingers of her right hand found the silver medallion which still dangled around her throat. "Shane, help me," she whispered without even thinking. She prayed this nightmare would just go away. And then she got her wish. There was a sudden flash of brilliant white light. The hard boots seemed to be knocked off her back. The man above her shrieked in surprise and pain. Blood splashed Ree in the face and fell all about her like rain. And then with a hard thud he was lying on the ground next to Ree. His face was inches from her, his wide, frightened eyes frozen open. There was a line of blood across his throat, and Ree could see his cut windpipe clearly exposed. He was dead. She squeaked in surprise and rolled onto her back. "Who's next?" Shane dared them. Ree didn't know who was more surprised, the robbers or her. Shane stood between the thieves and her. He looked different. He was no taller, but he adopted the warrior's stance, feet positioned in a lunge, short sword held out in front of him. His expression was hard and cold as ice. He looked quite fearsome. The robbers were startled, but recovered fast. They exchanged looks among themselves, and Ree could tell they were going to rush him all at once and try to overwhelm him. Shane just smiled and beckoned them to try to do so with his free hand. The thieves roared as one and charged him. Shane sidestepped the first one easily, ducked and tripped the second, pushed the third one into the fire, and kicked hot coals into the face of another. While two were busy screaming from the fire's effects, he spun smoothly on his heel and engaged the other two. The one thief danced easily about him, and Ree thought for a minute Shane would be skewered. But his reactions were smoother and faster than the robber. He sidestepped the stab and slashed his sword across the robber's wrist, making him drop the sword. Shane caught it by the hilt before the weapon had a chance to revolve once in its plummet to the earth, and with his own sword Shane slashed the side of the robber's neck. A well-placed kick to the chest knocked the fatally wounded man out of the way, and Shane turned his attention to the next thief. The other man tried to dodge Shane's attack, but he was too drunk with alcohol and stumbled. Shane spun the hilt of the sword around his fingers and stabbed him once in the chest, in and out. He then turned to the two burned robbers. One who got hot coals in the face rushed at him, shouting and slashing in wild, blind motions. Shane stabbed him in the side, mortally wounding him as he went crashing by. The last one, who got hot coals in the chest, grabbed a handful of them in his glove and threw the burning embers at Shane. It was a desperate action, meant to buy him time, and Shane knew it. He dodged the toss easily. But then the man crashed into him before he could bring his swords up to bear, and with a grunt and a thud they fell tumbling to earth. Shane dropped one of his swords. Each had hold of the other's hands, and they rolled about, trying to out-grapple the other. Ree crawled to her hands and knees as they rolled about, and painfully scrambled to where they had emptied her saddlebags. She took back her sword, and clutching it to her chest protectively, turned back to the fight. Shane and the robber were still wrestling on the ground. They scrambled and fought to break each other's hold. Their kicking struggle rolled them close to Bree. Both were so involved in the fight they didn't see her. Ree noticed the thief was a lot bigger than Shane. Another twist and a grump, and they bumped closer to her. Ree saw an opening and dove in with her sword. She felt the blade cut smoothly through flesh, scrape bone, and impale organs. There was a hideous scream and a shudder. Ree felt the man scream through the sword in her hand. She jerked the sword free and dropped it. Both men stopped moving. A deathly silence now blanketed the clearing, broken only by the cracks and pops from the fire. Ree just tried to catch her breath for a moment. A horrible thought occurred to her. What if in stabbing her captor she had made a mistake and accidentally killed Shane? "Shane?" she called fearfully. "Shane?" An arm flopped out from under the two men, and his fingers reached for her. Shane rolled his head over to look at her. He seemed very winded and struggled to catch his breath. "Still alive," he gasped. With a sob of relief, Ree grabbed his one hand with both of hers and clung tight. Then she fainted.